Test, test. Hello, hello, hello. I think you can hear me now. All right, good evening. It's good to see everyone tonight. Tonight we're going to be in Acts chapter 18. If you weren't in here last week or didn't do your homework, you've got mere seconds to read over that and get to it. We'll read a couple of parts from that, and some of it will be up on the screen tonight. But we're going to kind of review through Paul's next movement and his journey deeper, if you will, into Greece. Last week in chapter 17, when we left Paul, he had been in Athens. He was talking either to the Areopagus or at the Areopagus. I'm inclined to think speaking to the Areopagus based on history saying that they didn't really meet up on that rock anymore at this time, but it really doesn't matter. He gave them kind of a brief version of the gospel, and many of them were convinced and believed, but many did not. And towards the end of that conversation, Paul says something that really flies sideways and sticks in some of their craw, and why they didn't believe. And what was that? What was the hard part about the story of Jesus that didn't compute with some of those Greeks? Yeah, he come back from the dead, because I don't happen. Hadn't seen anybody lately do that. And you think about today, if Paul was coming to speak to a group of people here today in a modern world, if he said that, nobody would believe that, because I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand if you've seen somebody come back from the dead in here, because I might freak some people out if you raise your hand, but I don't think any one of you have. Now look, I'm not talking about being resuscitated. I'm talking about dead in the grave, 3 days dead, and then come back up out of the grave. And so very, very challenging thing to believe, but there is some belief there. And we talked last week about that. Gives me some indications about Paul's education level, his ability to speak convincingly, his use of Greek rhetoric, and his knowledge and command of the Greek language. And we can see that exists in his writing. I know that Paul disparages himself that he's not maybe an eloquent speaker or whatnot, but he was a great speaker. Tonight, we'll be introduced in the latter part of our lesson to Apollos, who is a learned and eloquent person, powerful and very, very convincing speaker. I wish we maybe had more about him and knew more about him. I have not looked in later Christian literature to see if there are any legends about him and what he continued to do, as we frequently do see in some Christian literature. That may be a good research project to go into and to look for. But tonight, he's going to move, and he's going to move slightly south and slightly to the west to the city of Corinth. Corinth on your map is here. I'll show you a close-up of it here in just a minute, at least from the aerial type view like this. But Corinth was a very strategic city for many, many centuries because it lay on a very, very strategic piece of land. The isthmus, or the very, very narrow strip of land that connected the Peloponnesian Peninsula to the Greek mainland. And if you know anything about the Peloponnesian Wars between Sparta and Athens, this is the route that Sparta would have taken about every time they wanted to go sit around Athens, burn down their farmlands, and stare at them across their walls in a veritable stalemate until it was time to go back and harvest the crops, and so the Spartans had to leave and go back. Keep in mind, in the ancient world, you did not have, at least in the time of Sparta and Athens, you didn't necessarily have people that all they did was military campaigns. They had to go, they had to work the field as well. Sparta didn't necessarily have to do that as much because they had slaves being willing to do that. But a very, very strategic piece of land. If we zoom in on it here a little bit, you can see it in the middle. We'll talk about her twin port cities, or her two port cities here pretty soon. But you can see that it is a very strategic path to get over to the other part of Greece, or to get back into the mainland of Greece. Obviously would involve land-bound trade and obviously maritime trade as well. And so you had an issue. The storms around the Peloponnesian Peninsula, if you tried to go around Corinth to get to the other way, it was very, very dangerous and very, very rough storms and stuff at sea. Sometimes it would save time to drag your boat across land there, to come in on one side of that isthmus and pull your boat up on rails. And keep in mind, we're not talking about gigantic British man-of-war, type ships like we're thinking about, or some modern-day ship, but some smaller shipping vessels, it may have been easier to transport them across land, or even take the ship partially apart and take it across land and put it on the other side to save time. in the days before outboard motors, when the only thing that powered a ship was either the wind or human effort on a set of oars. And so today they have done something to eliminate that, as they have cut a canal across this area, and very, very tightly. Now, this is when your kids would be on that ship and sticking their hand out, trying to grab the side as they're going through this, and very, very probably highly paid tugboat drivers that pull those ships through there. So this saves a ton of fuel, a ton of time in the modern day era there in Corinth. And so something similar but much shorter than maybe the Panama Canal today. Every once in a while, in the biblical narrative, we are given some time stamps. For example, if we look over in the Gospels, for example, you say in the so-and-so year of Caesar Augustus or something along those lines. Keep in mind the calendar that they used was not like our calendar. Now, our calendar is a Julian calendar, many refer to it as, because there's many things on there that are related to the ancient Roman calendar. For example, even the names of month have numbers in them. Octo for October is the number 8, Novum is 9, Decem is 10. But we look at those as our 10th, 11th, and 12th months. The month of June, the month of July, those things are named after people and goddesses, all those kind of things. But you didn't have they didn't go back and say, okay, this is the year AD or BC or BC or BCE. It has to be in the so-and-so year of so-and-so emperor, or maybe in the so-and-so year since the founding of Rome. That's the kind of dates that they have there, because not everybody would agree on that date. And the dating system that we kind of refer to, I don't ever use AD and BC because I think those are inaccurate statements to be taken literally. But we think about those weren't used by people in the time of Jesus. But every once in a while we can back into those numbers by being given some nice date that corresponds with government activity. And so in chapter 18, verse 2, if you read it, we have a reference there that Priscilla and Aquila are in Corinth because the Jews had been expelled from Rome. Okay, well, we can go to history and know that was done by Claudius somewhere in the year like 49 to 50. I think there's some disagreement maybe about exactly how to tie it to our modern day thinking, but we have a fixed thing that we can back into and say, okay, well, that's about this time. And then later on in chapter 18, in verse 12, you'll see it's a time when Gallio was proconsul in that area, in that region of Achaia and where Corinth is. And okay, well, maybe we can tie that to some historical records. So that's somewhere around 51 is the best of my understanding. So we've got a pretty tight window that Paul is in Corinth. And he's in Corinth for about a year and a half, the text tells us. So it's okay if we get it within 2 years, we're doing fine to get in that time frame. So here we are in the very middle, if you will, of the first century, and it gives us a little bit of idea about time where Paul is there. And so that helps out a lot, especially when you start trying to look at, well, did Paul write a letter from Corinth, or did he do this from Corinth, or somewhere around there? We can kind of see where Paul was in time, and it helps us date some of his letters. Now, most of his letters, it really doesn't make any difference when they were written. We can think about it theologically sometimes, the order in which they were written, and see how Paul changed his focus, for example, from really talking about the second coming of Christ in maybe his earliest letters to Thessalonica, and then when he's talking to Timothy and Titus, he really doesn't talk about that very much anymore, because I think Paul's resigned himself that he's going to die before Jesus comes back. And it turns out that he was correct in saying that. But it is kind of nice to kind of know where we are in time here. So that's the best window of time that I could back into based on those things. I don't know what month of 49 or what month of 51. I'm not like those people that try to figure out what day and week the earth was created and going into that. But in the city of Corinth, we see that it is a Roman city. It is a city that I think, if I remember right, was destroyed by an earthquake about 146 BCE. And then was rebuilt some decades later by the Romans when they took control of the Mediterranean and rebuilt it in a very, very Roman pattern. Most ancient cities, when you see them like on maps and stuff or in pictures, especially in like Palestine, they're up on mounds. And the reason they're up on mounds is because the city's built on top of a city, it's built on top of a city, it's built on top of a city in ruins like Troy or some other places like that. that are built like that. But it was rebuilt in a very, very Roman way, in a Roman pattern. It was a political and economic hub because of its geography. You think about where it was located, and ability that trade goes through there. You always want to kind of set your city back off the water a little bit. Athens is the same way. It has a port city, Piraea, and in the ancient world, I don't know, I haven't been to Athens lately, they built walls around Athens and then down to their port cities so they could bring things back and forth from the port without being attacked on that way. And so Corinth sits back up in the mountains. Usually you want to be back towards fresh water. That's the same thing like Antioch is on the Orontes River, but you don't want to be on the river right at the delta where it's brackish water going into the ocean. You want to be back upriver a little bit where you can get fresh water, but you want to have access to a port. And so Corinth was that way. It tells us a little bit about the population was probably very, very diverse there. The religions were probably very diverse there. And people from all over the Mediterranean world, maybe all over Europe, coming through there. And so a lot of different folks. And we see in Paul's letters to the church in Corinth that they do seem to be a lot of people that can't get along with each other very well. Even, essentially butting each other out of the way when they're taking the Lord's Supper. And so that maybe because a lot of different social classes, a lot of different social ranks present there. My understanding is at that time it was the capital of the province of Achaia. I think that's strange. We might think Athens would be that. But my understanding is Corinth was that capital. Now that's what I read. I didn't go beyond just reading that a couple of times and just took it to be gospel. Here, Paul, we are told at the beginning of the chapter that he meets up with Priscilla and Aquila. It takes place almost as if he, of course, he knows them, and they work together as tent makers. That word has brought a lot of conversation about what does that mean. We're picturing them making Boy Scout tents, around. Leather workers is sometimes what it's thought of to be. The word has even meant things in earlier Greek, I understand, to be people that built stage props for the theater. But most scholars, I think, agree that it's some sort of leather working or tent making thing that they were doing here, and they're working. It's what we've talked about in here before, that Paul had to support himself many times. He's not getting money wired to his bank account from the Antioch church. I don't know how the world Antioch church could even find him in doing that. There must be, because Timothy and Silas are able to find him back where he left him in Berea, there must be some at least short range communication between him and some of his people, maybe people that go back and forth, and somehow told Timothy and Silas that, hey, they were in Berea. Paul went to Athens, but now Paul's over in Corinth, so if you're going to join him, you come to Corinth. So he must have some kind of grapevine of information, but obviously maybe not all the way back to Antioch, and he goes and does report back to Antioch in the middle of our chapter here. And so these two individuals we're going to see also talk to Apollos here towards the end of the chapter. He is reunited, as I mentioned, with Silas and Timothy. Timothy, one of his trusted emissaries that he sends all over the place to carry letters, to go check on people. He leaves them behind like they did in Berea, but they're reunited here. I don't really know that we pick back up on when Luke is reunited with him. I didn't pay attention to that, look at that in the text, but I don't think we're back to the we passages, if you will. Again, I may be wrong on that. We get more of the same. Now, where does Paul go when he goes to Corinth? When we look in our text, he says here in verse 4, every Sabbath he would argue where? In the synagogue. That's right. I mean, if y'all can't get that right by now, I have done a poor job of instructing this class. He would try to convince Jews and Greeks. Again, we see that it's not the word ethnos, which would be sometimes translated Gentiles or nations in your Bible. Like we talked about before, we think maybe that are people that are ethnic Greeks that are not ethnic Jews that may be attending synagogue as God-fearers and or proselytes. And so we see when Silas and Timothy arrive from Macedonia, he's occupied with proclaiming the word, testifying to the Jews that the Messiah was Jesus. And when they opposed him and reviled him, he shook the dust from his clothes and said to them, your blood be on your heads, I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. And he doesn't go far. He's in a synagogue, and I guess he goes over next door neighbor to Titius Justus or Titus Justus, depending on how that word is rendered, and stays there in that house. But we do see that Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, is converted to Christianity. But what a statement that Paul makes here in shaking the dust off his clothes, a symbolic gesture. I don't want your land on me. I understand, I don't know this for truth or not, that like when Jews would cross Samaria, that they would take their sandals off when they got across Samaria and shake the dust off because they didn't want to take the dirt from that land onto their land. It's one of the reasons that Americans miserably fail to understand the Middle East these days and how important land was. Your land is not as important to you as land is to the Jews and other society. When God gave it to you, it's very important. And when it's set aside, it's very, very sacred. It's why we always get into a mess when we try to get in politics over there. But he shakes his clothes out against them, and he makes that statement kind of like, if I was the Jews that opposed him, I'd be like, good, go on. Quit coming to the synagogue. That sounds like a great idea to me. You go on to the Gentiles. Now, we know that Gentiles have heard the gospel message prior to this point right here. We think about, the very first one we read about that's converted is a God-fearer named Cornelius in Acts chapter 10 that Peter talks to and takes the gospel to he and his household. So the Gentiles have been converted, but primarily we are dealing with most Christians are Jews or proselytes, or we also know in some of our other chapters that we have studied that many devout Greeks and women, converted over to Christianity. But the focus of Paul's message going to be on the Gentiles. I guess he's just tired of being assaulted by these Jews. But even the leader of the synagogue is convinced. And so he's afraid, though, of what's going to happen to him in the city. And the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, we see this in 9 and 10, do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people. Now, God did not promise him that nobody's going to harass him. But he did say, because they're all going to get dragged in front of the proconsul here pretty soon, but he's not going to get hurt. That would be good news for me if I was Paul, because I was like, you know what, I'm still rubbing out the bruises maybe from that stoning I took a few years ago back in Lystra. I really don't want to be attacked. One of the things that we can tell from this verse is, we may just kind of read through this very quickly, but I don't know if we stop often enough and think about Paul's life was in imminent danger in preaching the gospel. We don't know what that feels like in the American church. Many of our brothers and sisters in Christ do know what that feels like. But he was in imminent danger of losing his life. Keep in mind, the Romans really probably wouldn't care too much if they killed Paul, except for the fact that Paul was a Roman citizen. And that may have changed things. But still, it's obvious to me that Paul was afraid, okay? Because he had to get reassurances in a vision. It's not just that he was inspired by the Holy Spirit that he would be safe, but that he was afraid. And he has to get a message directly from the Lord here that says, I'm going to keep you safe. And he says, I have many in this city who are my people. Now, that's an interesting statement. Paul would be like, who are they? Because just now getting this message out there into this town, but the Lord has people that he says they're going to take care of. Now, I don't really necessarily know how all that came to fruition and who these people were and how it wound up going, because Paul doesn't wind up, really seeming to encounter a whole lot of trouble much later than that. And so he does stay 18 months. I think the only place that we know of Paul stayed longer than Corinth was where? Ephesus. And not a spoiler alert, but we're going to talk about that next week. Okay, when we read chapter 19, a lot of interesting things happen in Ephesus, and he is there for a long period of time. One of the things we can think and take away from this 18 months is, if you have ever studied the two letters that we still have from the church in Corinth, to the church in Corinth, Paul was very intimately familiar with these people. He speaks to them 1 Corinthians, he deals with a lot of disunity or a lack of unity. I don't know what the right word to say is there. A disjointed congregation where there's competition and there's envy and there's jealousy, and he deals with there's the toleration of sin. There are lawsuits amongst each other, all sorts of messes going on there in Corinth. And in 2 Corinthians, he is really defending his apostolic authority because it's being challenged. There. And how can you imagine that would be the case? You'd be like, hey, but he was there for 18 months, and he already has enemies in place that are beginning to dislodge Paul's doctrine from these people's mind. And what that can tell us today is it doesn't take much, and it doesn't take long for people to begin to dislodge sound teaching, sound doctrine, in the absence of sound leadership. We've been studying 1 and 2 Timothy in a class I'm teaching on Sunday morning. We just started it on Wednesday afternoons in the Wednesday afternoon class. We started that today, and we just talked about we get so preoccupied, foolishly preoccupied with what's going on outside those windows. And unfortunately, many of you know this firsthand because you've been at congregations where it's gone on. The worst destruction will come from inside. The worst destruction will come from inside. All of Paul's letters, just about all and everything in them, is dealing with things that have arisen in the churches there. Issues between Jewish converts and Christian converts to Christianity. Some things come from the outside. Paul, we'll talk about this next week. He warns the Ephesian elders in chapter 20 that savage wolves are going to come in amongst you, and some will come from within you. And so here in Corinth, even after 18 months of having the inspired apostle Paul preach to you, who knows what all he taught these people. I'd love if we had all that recorded. It'd make the Bible very long, I guess, if we had everything that he recorded. But if he had just recorded them on YouTube and we could watch them, it would be amazing to have. But those YouTube recordings have been lost to history. We don't have those anymore at all. Don't mind that. Just think about there's trouble in Corinth, and it's not really that much longer after Paul leaves. It's not a decade, later after Paul leaves. We have this issue with the tribunal. The Jews bring this group, and he says when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal. They said, and I want you to picture Gallio's face, a guy who's trying to run the entire province of Achaia and could really care less about these Jewish problems, but he has to hear this out. And they say, this man is persuading people to worship God in ways that are contrary to the law. Now, you can read in your text how much Gallio really cared about that. Number one, I don't have any indication he even believed in the God they're talking about. And why do I care? Why do I care at all? How he worships God, or what he has to say about your Messiah that my government tacked to a cross and killed and put an end to that movement? They thought. Why do I care about this? And he says that this is things contrary to your law. What would have been the better thing for the Jews to say? This guy is announcing a king that's not Caesar. That's the better accusation. And we've seen that, right? These Jews, they weren't smart in doing it. What does Gallio care? He doesn't care. Before Paul even has the chance to speak up, Gallio essentially dismisses the case without prejudice. I don't want to hear any more about this. We're done hearing about this. I don't care. It doesn't have anything to do with Roman law. I've got 650 criminals to deal with this week and a bureaucracy, and I got to collect taxes, and I got to deal with the Roman legion in town. I got shipping and trade issues. I got pirates on the Mediterranean. I've got other things to deal with besides this crazy, obscure group of people who don't work 7 days a week, bringing me issues about their internal things about, I don't care. I don't care what they're doing. He's not rebelling against Caesar. He's not telling people not to pay their taxes. He's not stirring up sedition and treason against Rome. I got other things to do. And so Gallio is done with that. But these Jew and Gentile relations, at least they got a say, or at least they must have enough political pull. But then, poor old Sosthenes. David texted me today about that. Sosthenes, like, what would I do? Now obviously there's some turnover in the ruler of the synagogue because Crispus converted to Christianity, right? And so how long do you think Crispus would continue as ruler of the Jewish synagogue after converting to Christianity? 10 or 15 minutes, right? That he would continue to do that. So we have poor old Sosthenes has been like, I didn't convert to Christianity. Why am I getting beaten? We don't know. I don't know if they took it out on him for letting these things go on, why he has to bear that burden, but he just kind of, poor old Sosthenes, just get beaten. Now, there may be some history out there that I don't know about Sosthenes, but as far as I know in the text, it's not that Sosthenes converted to Christianity. Maybe he was allowing Paul to speak there still. I don't know what was going on, but he took a beating that I'm not really sure that poor guy deserved. We do see that at least the 18 months there broads a long-lasting relationship with Paul. We know that he wrote at least 3 letters to the church in Corinth. We have what we think are either his second and third or his second and fourth. 1 Corinthians 5:9, Paul refers to a previous letter that he wrote to the church in Corinth that's no longer extant for us to have. We don't have that. We were talking today after the Wednesday class, so maybe one day they'll dig that up in some library in the sands of Egypt and it'd be great to read. But the odds are, amongst the 5,500 some odd to 6,000 manuscripts we've discovered of the Old New Testament, I hadn't found it yet, may not be around. But I'm sure it'd be a great letter in doing it. And then over in 2 Corinthians, he refers to what's often called the severe letter. Some people think that 1 Corinthians is a severe letter because it's pretty severe. But there is some evidence for an interim letter between what we call 1 and 2 Corinthians. That's a lot of writing. And if you look at just the 2 letters we do have, they're pretty lengthy. We have a 16-chapter letter. Of course, it wasn't chapters back then, but a very lengthy letter. In case you don't know this, your New Testament letters of Paul are arranged due to length. And so what comes right after Romans? Yeah, y'all doing so good. Y'all been listening up on Sunday night. So proud of y'all. We're not going to sing the song because I don't sing very well at all. And so we're not going to sing that song. But a very long letter. And Romans is a very, very, very long letter. And so we see these 2 letters, a long-lasting relationship. He felt very free to rebuke them and talk to them and say, what are you acting this way? He even talks about the Lord's Supper. And I'm sure we've heard that when we've heard many capable people talk about the Lord's Supper. Paul was not he wasn't up in that room when Jesus broke the bread and passed around the fruit of the vine, right? And he says to the Corinthians in chapter 11, I was given these things from the Lord. Here's how it happened and here's what he said. Don't you remember how I taught that amongst you? And so he taught them about the Lord's Supper. He taught them all kinds of things. He reminds them of the things that he did. And in 2 Corinthians, did I ever try to swindle you when I was there? Did I try to pull the wool over your eyes? Was I like some charlatan when I was there? No, he loved and cared about these people. And I think that comes from this long relationship that he had with them. I don't know how many people were converted to Christianity because of Paul's teaching in Corinth, but I have a feeling it was a lot there. But he obviously didn't get killed. The Lord kept his promise. He didn't get attacked. He didn't get killed. Now, the Lord didn't promise Sosthenes that. For some reason, maybe Sosthenes needed a vision to protect him. And so after staying for some time, Paul said farewell to the brothers, and he sailed away to Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. Syria is where Antioch is. But I'm going to show you a little map here in a little bit. Now, here's something I want to stop and take care of in our teaching. He shaved his head at Cenchrea because of a vow he had taken. So that's a little bit of a weird statement in there that we get. It wouldn't necessarily have been a weird statement to Luke's audience necessarily. One of the 2 things have to be certain. Paul, or possible. One I think is absolutely absurd. The other is most likely. It is not unheard of that other priests and other religious sects of Paul's day in what I'll call the pagan world may shave their head for some reason. Okay, it's absurd to think that Paul was following a pagan practice. Okay, so we can dismiss that one out of hand. However, if you recall, and if you don't, you're going to see it here in just a second on the screen. In Numbers chapter 6, there were certain people who took a certain vow, and at the end of that vow, they shaved their head. And those certain people were called Nazarites, okay? That vow did not go away when we see in this time. So Paul took a vow, and at the end of it, he shaves his head. I'm going to show you a verse from 20 that we talk about as well. But just in case you didn't have this memorized, committed to memory, I know many of you have memorized the Torah, but in Numbers chapter 6, then the Nazarite shall shave the consecrated head at the entrance of the tent meeting, and shall take the hair from the consecrated head, put it on the fire, unto the sacrifice of well-being. The priest shall take the shoulder of a ram when it's boiled, and one unleavened cake out of the basket, one unleavened wafer, and put them in the palms of the Nazarites. All these strange things that they have to do after they shaved the consecrated head. The most likely explanation is Paul was under a Nazarite vow. Now, you don't have to be a Nazarite for life. We do know of a man in the Old Testament that was essentially a Nazarite for life. Who was that? Samson was a Nazarite from his birth. Even his mama couldn't drink from the fruit of the vine or drink any kind of wine that way. But he was a Nazarite essentially for life. And what they do, they didn't cut their hair while under a vow. But you didn't have to be a Nazarite for decades. You could be a Nazarite for days, months, weeks, whatever that may be. But Paul took some kind of vow right here, and looking at that, he runs into people later on when he goes back, and we're not going to spend a tremendous amount of time in this. But when he circles back around, the reason I wanted to put this up here is we're not going to study Acts 21. But when he goes back to Jerusalem for the last time before he gets shipped off to Rome, he reports back to the mother church in James and talking about things, and they're kind of like, hey, the Jews around here in Jerusalem are a little bit stirred up with you, Paul, because they say you've been going around telling Jews not to obey the law of Moses anymore, and it's kind of caused a little bit of a stink. And so I tell you what, we're going to help you out a little bit. We have 4 men here who've taken a vow. Take them, be purified with them, pay their expenses so that they may shave their head, that they may know all those things of which you were informed are nothing. So essentially what they're saying here to Paul is, hey, why don't you kind of sponsor these guys? Why don't you show us how you're still obedient to the Jewish law? And that way these people won't be so stirred up. Because what they say in the end of this is, we understand that the Jews are going to do things a certain way in keeping the law, but we're not going to make the Gentiles do it, except they can't eat food offered to idols, they can't eat blood, and they can't eat things that are strangled, and they got to keep themselves from sexual immorality. So they do have a couple of Jewish rules in there that they might have still pending. One of the reasons I share this with you, and just briefly, is do not suppose, because if the only way you do this is to completely ignore the biblical text, do not suppose that the paths of Judaism and Christianity immediately diverged at Pentecost. You can't read the Bible and think that. And to think that many Christians converted to Judaism ceased to observe anything in Torah. We know that's not true. Peter refused to eat what was shown to him in the vision because he said, I've never broken that law. I've never eaten anything unclean. I'm not about to start right now. Paul takes vows. He makes Timothy be circumcised. There are a lot of things that still preserve. The difference is, what Paul would argue in Romans and Galatians is, those covenant markers of distinction, such as circumcision or table fellowship or whatever dietary laws, Sabbath keeping, are not mandatory for justification under the new covenant in Christ. We don't have to have those to be righteous, to be made righteous anymore. They're not what connect us to God like Torah did. But it doesn't say never keep a Passover again. Never do those things again. There's nothing wrong with a Jewish Christian today observing Passover, because his people were freed from Egyptian captivity. I'm Polish Italian, okay? My people did not get freed from Egypt. And so it doesn't make any difference. Martin is not my birth name. My birth name is Terpolowski. I was adopted. Aren't you glad you don't have to write me anything that you have to spell that word out and thinking through that? But I don't have to celebrate my people being freed from slavery in Egypt, because they were never enslaved in Egypt. And so it's nothing wrong with that. So I want us to be certain and know that when we look at this, like, what was Paul doing? Taking a vow and following some Jewish. He didn't cease to be Jewish. And he didn't cease to do those customs. And you can't read the New Testament and think like we do today, and eventually those paths diverge completely. We almost teach an aversion to the Old Testament. And that really was not the case for the first centuries of Christianity. Their scriptures that were read every day in the churches were what we call the Old Testament. Very, very revered, especially the Greek translation and the Septuagint looking at this. So don't think it's weird that Paul did this. So he leaves there. He shaved his head. I already told you about Cenchrea. We're going to do a little bit around the world here in just a second. He goes to Ephesus. He says to the church in Ephesus, I'll come back to you if God wills. And guess what? God willed, because he's going to be there in the next chapter that we see and go back near there again later on in Acts chapter 20. Then he leaves there. He goes to Caesarea Maritima, which is on the coast. There's a lot of Caesareas in the ancient world. Then he goes up to Jerusalem, and then he goes down to Antioch. And so when we think about that, he leaves Corinth here. He goes down to the port city, at least the south port city of Cenchrea. If you look, you may not be able to see Leke Aeon, which is up there right above the word Corinth. That's the north port city of Corinth. So you got two different port cities feeding into that. Then he goes over and he bumps over to Ephesus, which is on the coast. Paul did a lot of sailing. Most people think Paul didn't get on a boat until he went to Rome, but Paul was on a boat to get to Ephesus. He goes to Ephesus very, very briefly. We'll talk about that more next week. And then he goes to Caesarea Maritima, a city built, I think, primarily by Herod the Great on the coast. Those of you who have ever been to Israel, you may have been to that and seen some of that great construction. The Romans had hydraulic concrete. They were pretty impressive people. And he goes up to Jerusalem. Now, I remember in 8th grade, how many took geography in 8th grade? Is that the mandatory age we took geography back in the days of Generation X? I remember some kid arguing with my geography teacher about the Nile River in Egypt did not flow towards the Mediterranean, but it flowed towards the equator because that's downhill on a map. That was a long discussion to get people to understand. Rivers end at oceans. They don't begin at oceans. And so when we see the word go up to Jerusalem, why is it up to Jerusalem? Because Jerusalem's in the mountains. And when it goes down to Antioch, Antioch is not in the mountains. And so he goes up into Jerusalem and then down into Antioch in Syria, back to where he originally had started out, he and Barnabas in their missionary work there. And then he goes up to check on the churches in the regions of Phrygia and Galatia there in the middle. And that's the other Antioch that we see in the New Testament. So a little bit of an excursus here. All of a sudden, Paul's narrative kind of ends, takes a brief pause, and we talk about Apollos in Ephesus and when he goes over into Corinth. So very related to what we just read. Apollos' resume includes that he is an Alexandrian Jew. And so Alexandria is down here in North Africa there on the bottom of your screen. Obviously, the message of John, who begins the Messianic movement that culminates in Christ, John's message got there because we know Apollos had the baptism of John, but also Apollos was very learned about the teachings of Jesus and had been educated in the way, and so Christianity had made it North Africa as well. I think the tradition in the Coptic Christian church in Egypt is that Mark brought the gospel to North Africa, but Alexandria was a center of Jewish thinking. Many tradition and legend, maybe legend's a better word than tradition, that the Old Testament began to be translated into Greek in Alexandria. It had a large Jewish population. Many of you may have heard of Philo, the Jew. He was an Alexandrian Jew. And Christianity, one sect and version of Christianity in Alexandria, kind of different than the Antioch church. But Antioch that we're talking about in Syria and Alexandria were really, really centers of Christianity in the first couple of centuries of the Christian church. Origen, for example, a famous patristic author, was from Alexandria in Egypt. But they tended to interpret the Bible very allegorically, kind of following the pattern of Philo, where Antioch, they kind of strictly went by the letter of the law. But that's another class that'll put you to sleep later on. He was an eloquent and learned man. The Greek word tells us that. And probably very, very well educated, well schooled in Greek, obviously able to speak very well, speak very convincingly. He was powerful in the writings. Most of your translations say powerful in the scriptures. That is, a translator's choice to write that word in there. But what we know is that tells us that he was very, very knowledgeable and learned in the Hebrew scriptures and probably in Greek and knowing him. And so I would love to sit down. If I could sit down and watch a conversation between ancient Christians, I would have loved to hear Apollos and Paul talk about Christ in the Old Testament and prove the case. I would say, prove it to me. You go, then you go. Put them behind a couple of podiums. I mean, they agree with each other. It wouldn't be debate, but it would be interesting to learn and hear what they have. The text tells us that he's instructed in the way of the Lord, which I believe the Lord there is referring to Christ, and he knew the story and teachings of Jesus. Now, if our traditional dates for the writing of the Gospels, the Synoptic and the Gospels and the Gospel of John is accurate, they haven't been written yet. Now, there are those who argue for an earlier date of their writing. But keep in mind, the oral tradition about Jesus was widespread and very strong, even on into the 2nd century. And they didn't instantly print out a 27-book New Testament, nor did everybody have the Gospels. But the oral tradition of Jesus very, very strong and spread, and he knew about it. However, he was still on baptism 1.0. Now, we know from Mark and Luke's Gospels that John's baptism was for repentance and the forgiveness of sins. We have no idea where that baptism came from. There are some who different theories about it, but it seems to just burst on the scene there with John the Baptist. It's a very interesting research to get into. I have a paper on it. If you really, really have insomnia, I'll let you borrow it sometime. But Priscilla and Aquila take him aside, and they teach him more accurately the ways of Christ and the right baptism for him to have. I have heard people argue that Priscilla did not speak, that only Aquila could teach him. If you want to say that, that's fine, but the Greek grammar disagrees with you strongly. The new tau omicron ending on that is the third person plural. They took him aside and they taught him in those verses. There's nothing wrong with it in thinking through. They were counseling this man about what is baptism and what is it correct in thinking through it. Some people may not like that thought, but I don't tend to go against grammar. Now, I'm sure there's arguments the other way around that. They both loved and cared about Apollos. And this guy was going to be a powerful and effective tool and be a great teacher. We've got to straighten him out because he only knows John's baptism. A really good guy. So he gets the correct version of that. And it's a question that we think through. How do you think Apollos knew so much about Jesus? I mean, the text would tell us that he seems to know all about Jesus, but he was ignorant, it seems, of, I'll call it, first century Christian baptismal theology. You know, in short, how come he didn't know that he had to be baptized in Christ? How would you not know that?
Because if the word left Jerusalem before the day of Pentecost, if what he had heard in Alexandria left Jerusalem in between the resurrection and the day of Pentecost.
Okay, what Richard was saying there is that if Alexandrian Christianity had been founded or spread there, or at least begun there, obviously John's message and discipleship existed there. Prior to Acts 2, Pentecost, and the resurrection of Christ, in between the resurrection of Christ and Acts 2, possibly they didn't understand, that he didn't understand that. That's an interesting thought. If, for example, if people were dispersed and thinking about that.
The last verse said that, he demonstrated through the scriptures, which would have been the Old Testament,
Yes.
that Jesus was the Messiah. He was very learned in that. And I don't know, is there anything in the Old Testament about Jesus' baptism?
No. That's one of the reasons we can't figure out where John's baptism comes from. Are there ceremonial washings for uncleanness and things like that in the Old Testament? Proselyte baptism, we don't have evidence of that until after Rabbinic Judaism comes in, after the destruction of the temple. We don't know. Ceremonial washings, certainly. Taking ceremonial baths and things along that way. But baptism for the forgiveness of sins and of repentance is unheard of in the Old Testament. We don't know where that came from. Now that would be a different teaching than reasoning through that here's why Christ was the Messiah. I would love to hear that discussion because I can tell you if I didn't have the New Testament, I would never believe that Jesus is the Messiah from just the Old Testament if the New Testament didn't explain to me those things. I don't know. I think Richard's explanation is interesting. We do know that Jesus said, go and make disciples, baptizing them. And so Jesus' last teaching before he left the earth, just a little bit, but not much time between that and Pentecost. It may be that the message of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus had spread to Alexandria, but maybe not the full plan of salvation, I guess, had gotten there. It's not absurd to think that people could have left Palestine and gone and spread the message and the teachings of Jesus. I mean, Jesus probably delivered hundreds of sermons that we don't have, and maybe that did spread there. I think Richard's answer is about as sound as I can think of, but he didn't yet know that and why he had to be baptized. Now, I'm going to tell you, just from the Gospels, you might not have a full, if you just knew the story of Jesus, you wouldn't have a full understanding of what baptism meant either. You would remember the baptism of John, and you would say, oh yeah, Apollos would say, my baptism is for repentance and forgiveness of sin, just like my teacher John taught me, but I don't know what all Priscilla and Aquila told him. I really wish I would be like, well, yeah, but it needs to be into Christ. Everything that we would rattle off in a study about baptism, I don't know that they may necessarily have that. So it could be that the immature message of Christianity had reached Alexandria, but not yet the full message of that. The answer truly is, we don't know for sure, but we definitely know we had to have it explained to him. All right, for next week, he left and did a good job. Acts 19, y'all read that, and we'll talk next week. Have a great rest of your week. Don't get flooded out on Saturday.